The sky was the color of old clay, red, cracked, and dry as bone. Wind moved slow and steady across the mesa, like an old horse dragging its breath. Taza rode alone, reins loose in his hands, eyes narrowed against the dusk. He hadn't spoken a word in 3 days. Didn't need to. The desert answered in its own tongue, creaking branches, circling hawks, the occasional whisper of coyote song beneath the sun's dying light. He didn't ride for purpose. Not anymore. Most days, he rode to stay ahead of the ache in his chest, to let his horse carry the weight his heart could not. The land had taken his wife 4 winters ago, stolen her breath in childbirth, and left behind a silence so complete it echoed louder than any church bell. Since then, the world had grown small, a one-room cabin, a buckskin saddle, a pair of worn moccasins by the fire. But this evening, something waited in the dust. His mare stopped before he tugged the reins. Her ears twitched. Head low. The scent of blood hung in the air like a memory not yet buried. Taza squinted toward the cluster of boulders, where the desert dipped into a shallow gully. A flash of white cloth. A figure, half shadow, half stillness. He dismounted without a word. The girl lay in the sand, a torn calico skirt tangled around her legs, her arms scraped raw, face blistered by sun and wind. Blood darkened her shoulder. Her long black hair was crusted with sand, stuck to her mouth as if the earth itself had tried to swallow her. Apache. That much he saw instantly. Her skin, her braids, the fine silver beading on what remained of her belt. But she was young, no more than 25. And someone had tried to erase her. He knelt beside her, placing 2 fingers lightly at her throat. A flutter. Weak but steady. He could have turned back, rode to town, told the sheriff. But he didn't trust white law to care for brown blood. And this one, she had not just been beaten. She had been discarded. He lifted her gently, her weight no more than a sack of flour, and carried her toward his mare. She stirred once, murmuring something in a tongue older than any preacher's gospel. He didn't answer. Didn't ask. He just held her closer as the last light gave way to stars. The ride back was slow. Each hoofstep echoed like a heartbeat. She breathed against his chest, shallow and soft, like someone afraid to be heard. When he reached the cabin, he laid her on his cot, the same one his wife had died in, and stoked the fire to life. The room filled with the scent of smoke and pine resin. He boiled water, crushed wild sage into the basin, and gently washed the blood from her skin. Her dress, what was left of it, hung by a thread. He found one of his old shirts and slipped it over her shoulders with care, eyes averted like a man touching a ghost. She didn't wake. Not fully. But when he wiped her face, she turned toward his hand like a child seeking warmth. Her lips moved one word, broken in 2. He couldn't catch it. But he felt it in his bones. Pain. Old and recent, braided together like her hair. He sat beside her through the night, elbows on knees, watching her chest rise and fall. Outside, the coyotes howled low, and the wind answered through the canyon in slow breaths. He didn't sleep. He hadn't slept in years. By morning, the desert had calmed. A light dusting of red sand coated the porch. He stepped outside, lit his pipe, and listened. No riders. No voices. Just the steady rhythm of something unfamiliar taking root. When he returned inside, she was sitting up. Barely. Her hands clutched the blanket around her shoulders, eyes blinking against the light. She looked at him, not with fear, but with the blankness of someone too used to cruelty to expect kindness. He set the water near her. Didn't speak. Just waited. She drank slowly, eyes never leaving his. Then she lowered the cup, her voice a whisper. Where? Red Clay Ridge, he said. My land. You were out past the basin. Nearly gone. She nodded once. No more. He wanted to ask who had done it. Why she was bleeding. Why her hands trembled when the wind touched the shutters. But he said nothing. Words had never done him any favors. Instead, he stepped back, gave her space. He cut up some venison from last night's hunt and placed the strips on a plate. She stared at it for a moment, then took it in her hands and ate, one bite at a time, like someone relearning hunger. Later, she stood slowly, holding to the wall. He offered no help, only watched. She made her way to the basin, poured water over her arms, rinsed the blood from her hair with shaking fingers. When she looked up into the mirror, her face was changed, not healed, not safe, but seen. By nightfall, she had spoken 3 more words. One was her name, Nalin. That was enough. He didn't ask more. The desert would tell him when it was time. The second night, she fell asleep wrapped in his late wife's blanket, her breath steady this time. He sat outside, beneath the stars, listening to the silence she brought with her. It was different from his own. His silence had been a grave. Hers felt more like waiting. Something in the wind shifted. A memory tried to surface, but he didn't let it rise. Instead, he stared at the horizon and whispered a prayer to no god in particular. Let her live. Let her stay. Let the town keep quiet. But even as the words left his lips, he knew better. This land never let a secret lie still for long. And soon, they'd come asking questions. Not about her scars or her story, but about why he let her stay. Still, he looked at the closed door behind him, at the lantern light flickering through the cracks, and for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. Not quite. The first week passed in hushes. Nalin did not speak unless necessary, and Taza did not ask. The space between them held more than words could carry: grief, caution, and the quiet weight of survival. She swept the cabin floor with care, folding her blanket each morning into the shape of a cradle. When Taza returned from the ridge with rabbits or firewood, he'd find the hearth cleaned, a tin cup warming beside the coals, her shoulders wrapped in the deer-hide shawl that once belonged to his mother. She limped some days. Her right leg wasn't fully healed, though she never spoke of the pain. Taza noticed how she touched her ankle with clenched jaws and forced steps. There was no complaint. Only resolve. Once, she stood in the doorway while he chopped wood, watching the blade split the silence. When he glanced up, she offered him a thin, pale apple from the tree behind the shed. It was nothing. But it was everything. The first signs of gossip came with the footprints. Old Jebediah, with eyes like an owl and tongue sharp as a spade, came to trade salt for tobacco. Taza saw him glance at the porch rail, where Nalin's washed shift hung to dry beside his flannel shirt. Jebediah didn't say a word then. But his silence came back to town carrying a story. By Saturday, the whispers had turned to shape. Apache girl up there with him? Eunice Gray asked behind the flour sacks at the general store. Ain't his sister, someone answered, tone sour as buttermilk. Sleeping in the same house, whispered another. They say she walks barefoot at night. Strange woman. Not right in the head. Or in the soul, added the pastor's wife. The town of Dry Rock had never been kind to solitude. Especially not when it wore brown skin and kept to itself. And Taza had done just that for 4 years, neither asking for trouble nor giving it. But kindness, in such places, was mistaken for permission. And silence, for guilt. The sheriff paid his visit on a Tuesday, late afternoon, when the sun was mean and the dust refused to settle. Harland Bly was a man who smiled with his teeth, not his eyes. He wore his tin star like a sermon and his belt gun like a scripture. He rode up slow, like the law had time to enjoy its own arrival. Taza stood on the porch, arms crossed. Nalin was inside, sweeping the corner of the cabin where wild thistles had blown in. Thought I'd stretch my legs, Bly said, tipping his hat. Heard you got company. Taza didn't answer. He only stepped down from the porch, letting the sheriff see the width of his shoulders, the stillness of his hands. Folk are talking, Bly went on. Say there's a woman here. Say she ain't kin. Say she don't belong. Belong where? Taza asked, his voice like gravel underfoot. Bly narrowed his eyes. You know how it is. Good people like their boundaries. And you've always kept to yours. Taza's jaw tensed. He looked past the sheriff toward the hills, where the last rays of light painted the stone red. She ain't breaking anything. Maybe not, Bly said. But some think you are. You're not just Apache. You're alone. That makes you a problem they can name. Taza didn't reply. He stepped back up the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. She stays. She got papers? She's bleeding. For the first time, the sheriff flinched. I found her half dead. Desert don't give second chances. I did. Bly exhaled slowly, as if patience had a flavor he disliked. Just, be careful, Taza. This town's got rules even it don't remember writing. When the sheriff left, Nalin stepped from behind the curtain. Her expression wasn't fear, it was knowing. As if she'd seen it all before. Taza didn't speak. He didn't have to. She began stitching the tear in her old skirt that night, needle slow and careful. Her fingers moved like memory. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the shadows, a cricket played its lonely tune. 2 days later, Jebediah returned. Not for tobacco this time, but for confirmation. Girl still here? He asked bluntly. Taza said nothing. Jebediah spat onto the dirt. Don't make sense. You living alone all these years like a ghost, and now this? You bring in a bleeding woman and keep her? His voice held no real curiosity, only judgment dressed as curiosity. Taza stared at him until the silence grew uncomfortable. She ain't yours, Jebediah muttered. Not in the eyes of law. Or the Lord. She's alive, Taza replied. That's all the Lord should care about. That evening, Nalin sat on the step, wrapping dried corn in cloth while dusk softened the world. Taza sat beside her, sharpening a hunting knife. For a while, neither spoke. Then she asked, "Why do they care?" He shrugged. Because they can't understand what don't belong to them. They want me gone? They want what's clean. And safe. And familiar. I'm none of those. I know. She didn't flinch. Didn't shrink. She simply continued wrapping the corn, each motion precise, like ritual. Later, she stood barefoot by the fire pit and whispered a song. It was quiet and full of breath, like something made of wind and broken glass. Taza didn't ask what it meant. But he felt the weight of it in his chest, pressing down on a place he hadn't used in years. He didn't see it coming, the shift. The thing that cracked the silence between them. It was a morning like any other. He saddled the mare to ride for supplies. When he returned, he found the porch swept, the water barrel refilled, and his mother's old basket lined with herbs. Inside, Nalin sat with a wildflower in her hair and a sewing needle between her fingers. Her face was half shadowed, half light. And for a moment, he saw something whole in her, a woman not defined by wounds, but by her refusal to disappear. That night, she placed the mended quilt over his chair. The same quilt his wife had made before she died. Not a word passed between them. But something shifted in the walls. And outside, in town, the talk turned sharper. They sleep under the same roof, Eunice Gray told the preacher's wife. She wears his mother's shawl, someone added. They say she speaks Apache into the fire. Some say she's cursed. Some say he is. They'll come for her if they think it's sin, the blacksmith muttered. They'll come for him if they think he's protecting it. But out at Red Clay Ridge, the wind moved through juniper trees, and the stars blinked above the cabin like witnesses who swore never to tell. And inside, Nalin lit the lamp and stitched a new thread into the same old blanket. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes did not. She did not ask to stay. And he did not ask her to go. Which, perhaps, is how all true things begin. The days lengthened into stillness. Summer ripened and curled at the edges, curling the yellow grasses and softening the paths where deer once passed. In the cabin, time moved not by clocks but by the sound of stitching, firewood splitting, and water poured from a tin pail. It was here, in these small rituals, that something invisible began to grow between Taza and Nalin, not love, not yet, but something slower, humbler. A kind of trust that asked for nothing and offered everything. Each morning, Nalin woke before the light and swept the floor in silence. She gathered herbs near the river, watched the hawks wheel over red clay ridge, and hung her washing with the kind of stillness that made rabbits stop to look. In her hands, even labor felt like prayer. She stitched by the window, fixing old garments with care that suggested reverence, not repair. It was the blanket that told him she intended to stay. The same one his wife had died under, the one with the burnt corner and the long tear down the middle, torn by a birth that never finished its story. It had sat untouched at the foot of his bed for 4 winters. Folded. Untouched. Holy. And one morning, Nalin had it stretched over her lap, stitching slow and steady with sinew thread. No announcement. No apology. Just the quiet motion of a woman healing something too old for words. At first, Taza couldn't look at her. He stood on the porch for most of that day, whittling a piece of cedar into nothing, listening to the sound of her needle pass through memory. Every stitch she made sounded like the soft footsteps of someone walking across a grave. Not out of disrespect, but out of return. That evening, when she left the blanket folded on the cot, he touched the seam with his fingertips. It was perfect. Straighter than the original. A single white bead, sewn into the repaired edge, glinted like a tear dried long ago. He didn't speak. Instead, he brought her a gift. It wasn't wrapped. He simply laid them at her door, a pair of moccasins, stitched with red ochre and buffalo sinew. They were crafted with the same care she had shown the blanket. Her name was carved into the inner sole, not the full name, just the beginning, Na. When she found them, she didn't cry. She didn't say thank you. But she touched them like they were alive, and the next morning, she wore them as she walked to gather wild mint. They began eating together more often, sharing meals in the quiet rhythm of mutual need. He hunted. She cooked. He fixed the broken fence posts. She planted bitterroot near the window. She still didn't speak of the place she had come from, nor the men who had left her bleeding in the gully. But he noticed she no longer winced when the wind passed over her back. One night, as rain pattered the roof like tiny drumbeats, she stood in the center of the room holding his wife's wedding dress. It had been folded in the bottom of the cedar chest for years. Yellowed now, with lace undone and a tear near the hem. Nalin didn't ask. She held it up, then folded it again with reverence and placed it back. He didn't stop her. There was something sacred in her silence, as if she had asked for permission without needing to speak. Later that week, he took her up to the ridge. They didn't speak much on the trail. The air was thin and cool, pine-scented and full of birdsong. He led the way through the narrow path until they reached a clearing where the world opened wide and the land fell away in gold and red slopes. She looked out across the canyon, wind lifting her braid, and closed her eyes. Then she asked the only question she had ever asked him, was she buried here? He nodded. Nalin knelt, not out of obligation, but from some instinct deeper than custom. She brushed the dust from a flat stone set into the earth. No name carved. Just a circle drawn in ochre. Apache way. No grave was owned. Only remembered. She died giving life, Taza said. And the baby didn't live either. She didn't answer right away. Then, so you buried 3 hearts that day? He looked away. I buried the 4th when the town stopped speaking to me. The wind moved between them. Not as a wedge, but as a bridge. She reached into her satchel and took out a strand of dark blue thread. Without ceremony, she tied it to a cedar branch beside the grave. It fluttered in the wind, something small, something seen. On the walk home, they didn't speak. But when they reached the cabin, she touched his wrist just once and held it for a second too long. Enough to say something that still didn't have a name. That night, she sat near the fire, brushing her hair. The shadows played along her face, highlighting the faint scar near her lip, the high cheekbones, the look of a woman who had not been made for gentleness but carried it anyway. Taza sat opposite her, mending the strap of a saddle. For a long while, only the crackling of the fire filled the space. Then, she began to hum. It was an Apache melody, slow, full of low notes that wove themselves into the corners of the room. He recognized it. His mother had sung it once during winter storms. It wasn't a song of joy. It was a song of endurance. He picked up the harmony not with voice, but with a low whistle. Their two sounds met in the middle, wrapped around the firelight like smoke curling upward. When it ended, she didn't speak. But she smiled. The sheriff hadn't returned since his warning, but the tension in the air had thickened. Taza saw it in the way the hawks flew lower, the way the town's horses flinched near the water troughs. Something was coming. Not a storm, but a reckoning. And both of them knew it. One morning, while she was pulling clothes from the line, he stepped out with his rifle. Checked the sights. Cleaned the barrel. She saw. Said nothing. But that night, she added an extra log to the fire and sat closer than usual. Their shoulders almost touched. Almost. At midnight, when the wind rose, she lay under the blanket she had repaired. He sat by the window, watching stars blink into dawn. Neither of them had declared anything. No vow. No intention. But the silence had changed its shape. It no longer separated them. It held them. And something unspoken waited at the edge of the dark, not to destroy what they'd found, but to test whether it was real enough to survive. The days had grown colder, though the sun still lit the mesa like a lantern hung low over a dying world. Mornings began with frost on the porch rail and ended with the hush of firewood cracking beneath the night's breath. Taza moved quieter now, as if each step were a decision. Nalin, too, had changed, not in voice, but in presence. There was something more solid in her stillness, like a root that had chosen the soil after a long drift. She had begun keeping his rifle near the hearth. Not touching it. Not asking. Just watching. It was the same rifle that had guarded his cabin for years, untouched since the day he buried his wife. He had cleaned it only once since on the morning after Nalin arrived, though he hadn't fired it since the war ended. Yet now, she would glance at it while she sewed, or while turning corn in the skillet, as if memorizing its weight with her eyes alone. Taza noticed. He said nothing. But on the 7th morning of October, she took it in her hands. It was early. The frost hadn't yet melted, and the window panes held a faint silver mist. She stood by the table, the rifle cradled in her arms like a child. Her fingers traced the worn wood, thumb brushing the notch she had carved during a siege long past. She didn't lift it. She didn't aim. She just held it, firm, steady. He came in from the cold, boots coated with red clay dust, and stopped in the doorway. She looked up, not startled, but expectant. He didn't ask why. She didn't explain. But the message hung in the air between them, as sure as the scent of pine smoke in her hair. Later that day, he began packing. Dried meat, hard biscuits, herbs, a rolled blanket. He laid them in his saddlebag, not in panic, but with the same care one might take carving their own name into a tree before leaving it behind. Nalin watched from the doorway. "So you go?" she asked softly. He nodded. "They'll come. Sheriff, or worse. They already have." He paused. "I won't let them hurt you. And you think leaving me here will stop them?" He didn't answer. Her jaw tightened. She stepped forward and placed the rifle on the table between them. "If you leave, I'll still be here when they come. But I won't be the same woman." Taza's eyes met hers, and in that glance, something shifted. She was no longer someone he had found in the desert. She was someone who had chosen to rise from it. That night, the wind howled harder than it had all month. It swept through the cracks in the shutters and rattled the lanterns. They sat across from each other, not speaking. But her hands were busy binding sage into tight coils, sharpening a skinning knife, tucking dried corn into a cloth pouch. He watched her without interruption, though his chest ached with the kind of fear he'd only known once, when he had buried his wife and the infant beside her. This, though, was worse in a different way. That loss had been final. This was a threat still forming, still walking toward them with boots they could already hear in their sleep. In town, things had curdled. Eunice Gray had seen Nalin with her braid down near the riverbank. Jebediah had heard her speaking Apache to the sky. And Sheriff Bly had spoken with the preacher about moral standing. The words used weren't always ugly, but the meaning was. The girl was not married. She was not Christian. She was not safe. By Thursday, a small group had gathered in the back of the blacksmith's shed. Not all men. 2 women. 1 teenage boy. A torch or 2. No plan, just a rising tension and the self-righteous swell of a town that had nothing else to fear except what it could not own. The next morning, the first sign came as a sound. Hooves. 4 riders. Then 6. Then 10. They didn't come shouting. Not yet. That wasn't how dry rock did its cruelty. It wrapped it in calm, in structure, in concern. But the weight of it could be felt in the way the ground trembled beneath the riders, and the way the blue sky seemed to grow dim without clouds. Taza and Nalin stood side by side on the porch. He offered her the rifle. She didn't take it. Instead, she walked inside, tied back her hair, pulled his late wife's deer-hide shawl around her shoulders, and returned barefoot. Then she held out her hand. He placed the rifle into her palm. She stepped down from the porch first. The riders paused just beyond the clearing, Sheriff at the front, Jebediah on his left, the preacher's boy on the right. A few others hung back, shifting in their saddles, unsure of what courage looked like. Sheriff Bly removed his hat. His voice was low, almost polite. "You're harboring someone who doesn't belong, Taza." Taza stood tall. "She belongs to no one." "That's exactly the problem." The others murmured, unease cloaked in certainty. Nalin stepped forward, the rifle still cradled at her side. Her feet were red with dust. Her eyes held the kind of calm that made even the wind stop to listen. "I bled in your desert," she said, her voice firm, unshaking. "Not one of you came to find me." "He did." "Doesn't change the law," Jebediah muttered. "What law?" she snapped. "The one that protects what you fear? Or the one you make up when someone won't bow?" The preacher's boy looked away. The sheriff shifted. "It's about order." Nalin raised the rifle, not at them, not at the sky, but high enough to show she knew how to use it. Her finger was steady on the trigger. "I'm not here to be kept. I'm here because I survived." No one moved. The silence was thick. Even the horses seemed unsure. Then, without warning, Eunice Gray turned her horse around and rode off. One by one, others followed. Only the sheriff remained, hat still in his hand. He looked at Taza, then at Nalin. "Be careful," he said. She nodded. "You too." He turned and left without another word. They stood in the clearing for a long time after the last hoofbeat faded. Taza let out a breath that had lived in his chest for too many years. He looked at Nalin, her eyes still fierce, her body still braced as if the threat might circle back. Then, gently, he touched the barrel of the rifle and guided it down. "It's over," he said. "No," she whispered. "It's just begun." Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight. The mended blanket lay across the bed, folded neat. A loaf of bread cooled on the windowsill. Outside, the landside, as if relieved to be trusted with one more secret. And far off, beyond the ridge, the wind carried the whispers of a town unsure if it had seen rebellion or grace. But at the cabin, 2 people sat close, still not lovers, not yet, but something older, something earned. Tomorrow, they would face whatever came next. Tonight, they had silence. And in her hands, the rifle still held the warmth of defiance. The desert woke before the sun. Long before light bled over the horizon, the land stirred with a breath older than memory. Crickets went quiet. The owls withdrew. A hush settled that wasn't silence, but expectation. Taza rose from his bed as if he'd never slept. Beside him, the fire had burned down to a quiet glow, and Nalin was already at the window, her shawl drawn tight across her shoulders, eyes fixed on the horizon. "They'll come again," she said softly. Taza didn't argue. He simply stepped into his boots and began to gather what they would need. This time, they would not knock. There was no need to speak about what was happening in town. They had felt it in the air for days. After that first confrontation, word had spread not just of defiance, but of insolence. The Apache girl had pointed a rifle at the law. The widower had let her. People didn't like stories without proper endings. They liked sins punished. They liked women quiet. But Nalin had not been quiet. And Taza had not stepped in front of her. So they would come again, this time not to threaten, but to claim. The morning passed like a held breath. Nalin brewed tea from wild mint and crushed bark, pouring it into 2 cups without spilling a drop. They sat on the porch, both facing east, both waiting. Her braid fell over one shoulder, black as raven's wings, her eyes calm but watchful. When the dust cloud rose on the ridge, neither of them flinched. 4 riders. Then 6. Then 9. They came slow, methodical. No torches this time. No words shouted. Just the quiet authority of people who believed they were on the side of righteousness. Taza stood. Nalin remained seated, sipping her tea. When the riders stopped 10 yards out, it was Sheriff Bly who dismounted first. He removed his hat again, as though civility still mattered, though his eyes held something colder than before. Behind him, Jebediah held a shotgun across his knees, and a few other men clutched rope, like they didn't expect to use it, but hoped they might. "Don't want to spill blood," Bly said. "Then turn around," Taza replied. "We gave you a chance. You ignored it." "I didn't ignore it. I refused it." The sheriff looked to Nalin then. "Girl, if you come with us quiet, no harm will come. We'll take you to the church. They'll find somewhere proper for you. Somewhere safe." Nalin didn't look at him. Instead, she set her tea down and stood. Walked slowly into the house. The men tensed. Taza held still, not blinking. Then she emerged again, barefoot, as before. Only now, she wore her wedding beads. Not a white dress. Not lace. Just red clay, her shawl, her breath. And the rifle. She did not raise it. She only held it at her side, walking down the steps until she stood beside Taza, shoulder to shoulder. A bead of sweat ran down Jebediah's cheek. "I am not yours to correct," she said. The wind stirred. The preacher's son shifted in his saddle. "You're living in sin," he said, his voice trembling under the weight of memorized words. "There's no marriage. No right." Nalin looked at him, and for the first time, her voice rose. "My blood soaked this land before your church stood. My name was sung before your town had fences. I do not need your permission to live." A murmur ran through the group. Taza stepped forward, not between her and the men, but beside her still. "You've decided she needs saving," he said, voice even. "But she already saved herself." "You won't leave her?" Bly asked. "No." "You'd fight your own kind?" "You're not mine," Taza said. "Not anymore." The wind picked up, sweeping across the clearing, lifting dust in lazy spirals. The sun rose higher, striking Nalin's beads with a sudden glint that made Jebediah squint and blink, as if seeing her for the first time. "She's bewitched him," he muttered. "Or freed him," someone else whispered. The moment teetered. Taza reached for the rifle. Nalin let go without hesitation. Together, they aimed not at flesh, but at the ground. Then, without a word, he fired into the dust, a warning. The echo rang out over the ridge, across the silence, into the deep ribs of the desert. The men flinched. But they did not advance. Bly stood still, jaw clenched. "We'll return." "No," Nalin said. "You won't." The way she said it wasn't threat but prophecy. Then something unexpected happened. The preacher's son turned his horse. No grand gesture. No declaration. Just a slow turning of reins. Another man followed. Then 2 more. Within moments, half the group had gone, leaving behind the sheriff, Jebediah, and one woman who looked too embarrassed to stay. Bly mounted his horse last. He didn't speak again. Didn't need to. The leaving said it all. When they were gone, Taza lowered the rifle. Nalin exhaled. Her hands shook. She didn't try to hide it. He reached for her, not possessively, not protectively, but like a man recognizing something sacred. She let him hold her hand. They walked back inside without a word. Later that day, as clouds gathered at the edge of the sky and the wind settled into a gentler rhythm, she placed the rifle back in its spot by the hearth. Taza poured water into the basin and washed his face. Then hers. They sat by the fire, bare feet brushing beneath the table, her sewing in one hand, his knife in the other. When evening fell, she rose and placed something in his hand. A braid of her hair. Wrapped in red thread. Soft. Intentional. I'm not your wife, she said. Not yet. But I've chosen you. His voice was gravel. I've chosen you back. Outside, coyotes called from the far ridge, their song low and mournful. But in the cabin, all was still. Some said they saw the smoke from town that day, thought the cabin had burned. Others claimed she was a witch who'd cursed the wind. Some swore they'd seen her walk barefoot into the canyon and vanish into mist. But those who listened closely, those with long memories, said something else entirely. They said the desert had kept her. That when the law came to take what didn't belong to it, the land itself rose in defiance. And in the hush of that standoff, something sacred was named. It wasn't marriage. It wasn't property. It was love, stitched out of silence. As the last light died on the ridge, a whisper could be heard, soft as smoke. Some stories the desert buries. But others, it bears witness to. And never forgets.